Welcome to the deep dive. We love taking a stack of really unique sources and just extracting those ultimate aha moments for you. And today we're doing exactly that.
Yeah, we are exploring a genuinely fascinating premise today. It's really out there in the best way.
It really is. So imagine three of literature's most tragic, completely misunderstood figures. We're talking Shakespeare's Shylock, Victor Hugo's Jean Valjean, and Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina.
Three absolute heavyweights.
Right. Now imagine them washing up together on a deserted beach.
Just the three of them.
Exactly. There are no authors pulling the strings anymore. There are no rigid 19th century drawing rooms, no Venetian courts of law. It is just a wreckage of timber, some saltwater swollen books, a broken lantern, a small fire, and these three people forced to confront what happens when their stories end, but they still have to somehow exist.
It's such a brilliant setup. The source material for this is actually a blog post published on April 26, 2026, by a writer named Farid Novin.
And it's not some polished corporate site, right?
No, not at all. It has that classic unpolished internet feel. Like, it has a vintage blogger logo, an Atom feed for comments, and a sidebar linking to these really mysterious pieces like the turning measure and smoke in the upper rooms.
Which honestly just adds to the atmosphere.
Yeah, it really does. But the main event of the blog is this script for an original one-act philosophical drama titled The Island of Reckoning. And the whole point is that it isolates these massive, iconic characters from the plots that basically destroyed them.
Right, but before these characters can even begin to figure out what to do with their future on this island, they have to unpack the crushing, heavy baggage they've dragged onto the beach with them. I mean, they are completely defined by the judgment of the societies that condemn them.
Yeah, to understand the gravity of this, you really have to look at the specific wounds they're carrying. The playwright gives us a setting that it perfectly mirrors their psychological state.
Yeah.
Well, we see a divided stage. Downstage right features this wild, impenetrable jungle casting these massive long shadows. And then on the other side, there is an open gray sea that is neither hostile nor welcoming. It's just vast and indifferent.
So it's like a waiting room.
Exactly, a liminal space between existence and oblivion. And right in the middle of this, Valjean is doing what Valjean does best. He's laboring.
Of course he is.
Right, he's methodically tending a fire, noting that even in this impossible, authorless place, the human body still demands labor, shelter, and bread.
Which makes perfect sense for Valjean. I mean, this is a man who spent 19 years in a brutal penal colony doing hard labor, and originally that was just for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving children.
Yeah, 19 years for a loaf of bread. It's unthinkable.
It is. His entire existence has been defined by physical endurance and the constant threat of starvation or capture. Meanwhile, you have Anna. She's sitting on a piece of driftwood, just staring at the sea. And she expresses this profound sense of relief that there is no society here to condemn them.
Which, given her backstory, is completely understandable.
Yeah, no whispering aristocrats, no judgmental stares.
Right, because Anna spent the entirety of her narrative trapped in a suffocating, loveless marriage in 19th century Russia. When she sought genuine passion outside of those rigid confines, high society didn't just frown upon her, they actively isolated and crushed her.
All while her lover faced practically no consequences whatsoever.
Exactly. So her relief at the empty beach is palpable. But then there's Shylock. He's pacing the sand like a man who is accustomed to being constantly watched in the Venetian ghetto, and he sharply counters her.
He's not buying the relief.
No, not at all. He insists that judgment travels within us. He says it doesn't need a formal court or a ballroom. It makes its home right in your chest.
Wow. And Shylock knows a thing or two about formal courts. In The Merchant of Venice, he isn't just defeated, he is systematically stripped of everything. The Venetian court takes his wealth, his livelihood, and forces him to abandon his religion and convert to Christianity.
It's a complete erasure of his identity.
Total erasure. So when they start discussing what they truly wanted from the worlds that destroyed them, Shylock says he just wanted justice. He wanted to be recognized as a man, not a monster or some convenient cautionary tale.
And Valjean chimes in that he simply wanted redemption after losing his life to the cruelty of the law.
Yeah.
Anna, on the other hand, admits she just wanted real love. Not the polished theatrical performance of it demanded by Russian high society, but, authentic connection. And this prompts Anna to make a really brilliant observation about Shylock's desire for recognition. She actually warns him about the trap of being seen.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Anna's point about recognition is phenomenal. She tells Shylock that society did recognize her. They saw her with perfect clarity, and they used that exact clarity to completely dismantle her life.
Right, visibility isn't always safety.
Exactly. She describes this kind of recognition as only surveillance wearing a courteous face. It's like being verified on a social media platform. It sounds great, it feels like validation and status, but practically, it just means the mob knows exactly where to find you when they decide it's time to tear you down. The courtesy is just the bait for the trap.
That is such a powerful way to frame it. Because visibility is inherently dangerous for marginalized figures in rigid societies. For a woman in Anna's position, being seen didn't mean being understood or valued. It meant being policed. Every action, every glance was monitored for deviation from the norm.
Yeah, they were all heavily policed in their own ways.
Exactly. And since all three of them were ultimately failed by their societies, they naturally fall into this fierce debate about the mechanics of surviving in a broken world.
And Valjean approaches this from a very idealistic angle, which is so him. He argues that truth without compassion becomes cruelty. And he's clearly thinking about Javert, right? The relentless police inspector who hunted him for decades.
Oh, absolutely. Javert represents men who mistake their absolute rigidity for integrity. They just cause misery everywhere they go because they refuse to bend for human context.
Right, but Shylock immediately recognizes the danger in Valjean's worldview. He fires back, arguing that compassion without truth becomes hypocrisy.
Which is such a sharp counter.
It really is. Shylock is calling out the so-called mercy of the powerful. In Venice, his oppressors claimed they were showing him mercy by sparing his life, but the cost was his forced conversion and total humiliation.
Yeah, Shylock sees compassion as a luxury item for the victorious. It's a way for people who have already ruined someone to feel morally superior about themselves without making any actual sacrifices.
Wow, yeah. So Anna acts as the mediator here. She asks the obvious question, if truth without mercy destroys you, but mercy without truth is just hypocrisy, what actually exists between those two extremes?
And Valjean proposes a third option. He calls it responsibility.
Responsibility.
Yeah, he defines this as the act of authoring oneself despite the past. Like choosing your own moral compass rather than just reacting to the labels the world tattooed on your soul.
So what does this all mean? Because honestly, Valjean sounds a bit privileged here, doesn't he?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, it's easy to preach about authoring yourself when you were handed a massive head start. Valjean got a literal silver lifeline. The Bishop of Dimnig caught him stealing silver candlesticks, covered for him with the police, and told him he had bought his soul for God. Telling Shylock or Anna to just author themselves out of their misery, it's like telling someone who is drowning to simply choose to swim when their hands are tied behind their back.
You're absolutely right, and both Anna and Shylock fiercely challenge Valjean on that exact discrepancy. Shylock points out the obvious. He never received a bishop's grace. When he hit rock bottom, there was no wealthy cleric offering him silver and a second chance. There was only the crushing weight of the state.
And Anna's experience was completely restricted, too.
Right. Anna argues that the self doesn't make choices in a vacuum. She had to navigate a locked room built by a society specifically engineered to punish female autonomy. The architecture of her world dictated her failure right from the start.
I'm really stuck on what Valjean does next, though, because he can't just ignore their reality without looking like a massive hypocrite. If he insists on absolute free will, he just dismisses their genuine trauma.
Well, Valjean actually conceives the point, and it changes the entire dynamic on the beach. He admits that human agency is heavily compromised by environment. He tells them, and this is a quote, "The man who is starving does not freely choose to steal."
Oh, that's a huge admission from him.
It is. By acknowledging that their choices were restricted by the architecture of their worlds, he validates their pain. But this concession forces a much larger, darker realization. If they were trapped in locked rooms of circumstance, they have to confront the reality of the architects who built those rooms.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the architects of those locked rooms were their own authors. They are essentially doing a post-mortem on their creators. It's fictional therapy.
That is exactly what it is.
Anna looks around the island and realizes they've been brought to this jurisdictionless space to exist without their author's permission. To live without what she calls the chapter break that says the pain is now meaningful.
That phrase is just, it highlights how authors use character suffering as a tool. Pain in literature is almost always instrumental. It serves a moral lesson, a tragic arc, or a thematic point. But on this island, their pain doesn't mean anything to an audience. It's just their pain.
Yeah, it's not a plot device anymore.
Right. And Valjean begins the critique by analyzing Victor Hugo. He admits Hugo built him a beautiful, massive literary cathedral. But Valjean notes that Hugo only understood the grandiose architecture of compassion. He didn't actually understand the cold, daily interior of true suffering.
And then Anna turns her sights on Tolstoy, and her critique cuts incredibly deep. She recognizes that Tolstoy gave her immense intelligence, vitality, and desire. He loved creating her.
But then things changed.
Yeah, as Tolstoy's own rigid moral and religious views solidified, he became terrified of the very female autonomy he had written into her. So, to restore the moral order of his universe, he threw her under a train. He executed her with great artistry and genuine discomfort.
It's brutal.
It is such a haunting thought when Anna describes the peculiar thing to have been destroyed by someone who admired you. It implies that their creator's empathy was entirely conditional. They were loved only as long as they served the narrative, and they were sacrificed the moment they became a threat to the author's worldview.
And Shylock feels this conditional empathy more acutely than anyone. He is haunted by the final 4 words Shakespeare assigned him before he exits the play forever.
Wait, what are the 4 words again?
He says, "I am not well."
Oh, wow.
Those words are incredibly ambiguous. Shylock confesses he doesn't know if Shakespeare wrote them in a sudden flash of sympathy for a broken, humiliated man, or if they were written as a final, pathetic punchline for the audience to laugh at the defeated villain.
The ambiguity of those 4 words must be maddening. He doesn't know if his creator pitied him or despised him.
Exactly. Regardless of Shakespeare's intent, Shylock realizes those 4 words serve as the only container he has for all of his unspoken, unnarrated grief. But having mentally fired their authors, having recognized that their pain was engineered for someone else's benefit, they now have to figure out how to live with the psychological residue left behind.
And that residue is an immense, blinding anger.
Yes.
So, to move forward on this island, they have to grapple with the concept of forgiveness, but the play refuses to offer a simple, sanitized version of healing. Shylock flat out refuses to forgive his abusers in Venice because he recognizes forgiveness as a systemic trap.
And the mechanism of that trap is fascinating. Shylock explains that if he continues to rage against his humiliation, society calls him a monster, effectively denying him justice because he is being unreasonable.
Right.
But if he chooses to forgive them, he releases his abusers from the consequences of their actions, effectively validating their terrible behavior. The system is designed so there is no version of reality where the victim is simply permitted to be right and the abuser is forced to be wrong.
And Anna completely backs him up. She describes the forgiveness her society offered as a conditional amnesty. Society would welcome her back and forgive her indiscretions, but the cost was her silence, her submission, and her total erasure. She would have had to pretend the violence against her spirit never happened.
And this impasse is where Valjean pivots the conversation entirely. He clarifies that he isn't asking them to forgive their abusers. He isn't asking them to minimize the injury or pretend it was a misunderstanding. He introduces a much more difficult concept. He asks if they can forgive themselves.
That is a massive shift in perspective.
It really is. He asks if they can forgive themselves for the dirty, undignified compromises that survival required. Can they forgive themselves for participating in their own destruction? And most importantly, can they forgive themselves for letting their anger become the entirety of their identity?
You know, it's like Shylock has been carrying around this massive, heavy iron shield for so long to protect himself from the abuses of Venice. He has held it up for years, and now his arm has literally frozen in that defensive position. Valjean is gently telling him he is safe now, he can put the shield down.
Yeah, put the burden down.
Right. But Shylock is looking at his arm saying, I can't, the metal is fused to the bone, it's a part of my anatomy now. Letting go of the anger feels like amputating a limb.
And the psychology of that is incredibly accurate. Shylock admits that self-forgiveness is the hardest debt to repay, specifically because oneself is always present for the negotiation.
Oh, that's profound.
Right. When you try to forgive yourself, you can't use PR or spin. You know every flaw, every failure, every single moment of weakness. But Anna realizes the deeper mechanism at play here. As long as you focus on forgiving or hating your abusers, your energy is tethered to them.
You're still letting them control you.
Exactly. Self-forgiveness is the only act that centers the power back on your own agency. It is the only debt that, once paid, cuts the cord entirely.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of the play. If they can manage to thaw that frozen arm, if they can put down their shields and sever that psychological tether, what do they actually do with tomorrow?
Well, the playwright uses the environment to signal a shift here. Dusk falls over the beach. The Pacific stars begin to appear, and that menacing storm that had been threatening the island all afternoon, it simply dissipates.
The waiting room is clearing out.
Yeah, and in the quiet that follows, Anna articulates a new purpose. The goal isn't to build a raft and escape back to the societies that ruined them. The project is habitation. She describes habitation as the hard work of learning to live inside your own mind, as if it were a house you deliberately chose to build,
Right.
rather than an assigned prison you were desperately trying to break out of.
I love that. The idea of the mind as a house you are actively furnishing rather than a cell. And this leads to a huge breakthrough for Shylock. He realizes that despite having all of his formal power stripped away in Venice, he actually has been writing himself all along.
In what way?
He authored his own resistance through his stubbornness, his fury, and his absolute refusal to pretend he wasn't wronged. He notes that he was writing himself in the only ink available to me.
That's a great line. And Anna builds on that, stating that her ink was passion. Both of their manuscripts, their lives in the novels and plays, ended tragically because the authors demanded it. But the act of writing themselves was real, and it is the reason they were sitting on this shore together, capable of surviving. So when Anna asks the group what they should do with the upcoming day, their answers act as a synthesis of everything they've learned.
Shylock, who has learned the brutal art of endurance, simply says, survive it. Valjean, who understands the need for labor and structure, says, build something. And Anna, who finally has the unmonitored space to exist, says, live it.
And the stage directions in that final moment are incredibly evocative. The playwright notes that the ocean surrounding the island suddenly feels like an enormous amount of available space.
Instead of a barrier.
Exactly. It transforms from a boundary keeping them trapped on a deserted rock into an open horizon representing limitless, unscripted possibility.
We absolutely have to talk about Friednoven's note on the narrator at the very end of the blog post because it changes how we interact with this entire piece.
It really does.
The playwright explicitly states that this play must have no narrator. He dictates that the silences on stage must be long and uncomfortable. No comforting voice is allowed to swoop in from the wings to reassure the audience that Shylock will definitely heal or that Anna will find peace. The note says the only narrator allowed is the sound of the ocean.
That structural choice is the ultimate sign of respect for these characters. I mean, they have been narrated to death. Shakespeare, Hugo, and Tolstoy controlled their every thought and movement.
Every single one.
Right. The greatest gift Friednoven can give them is unmediated, unobserved space. The uncertainty of their future on the island isn't a flaw in the narrative design. The uncertainty is the evidence of their newfound freedom.
It is so rare to experience a story that forbids a narrator. We are so used to stories, articles, or books telling us exactly how to feel at the end. We are conditioned to expect the neat moral bow. But here, the playwright forces us to sit in the messy, unresolved discomfort right there on the sand with them. We have to trust these characters to figure it out, without an author holding our hand and promising a happy ending.
Because that mirrors the reality of our own lives. There is no omniscient narrator explaining our pain to an audience or promising us that our current struggles will neatly resolve in the next chapter. We only have the choices we make today.
And that brings this whole analysis right back to you listening to this. This play isn't just a clever metafictional thought experiment about classic literature. It is a direct challenge for you to examine the locked rooms in your own life. Are you actively authoring your own choices, even if you are working with the limited ink of bad circumstances? Or are you just playing out a script that society, your job, or your past wrote for you?
It forces us to catalog the heavy baggage we drag onto our own beaches. Like, have we accepted conditional amnesties just to keep the peace? Are we refusing to forgive ourselves for the compromises we had to make to survive our own personal shipwrecks?
Exactly. So, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. Imagine that storm clears, the Pacific stars come out, and you find yourself washed up on the island of reckoning. But you aren't sitting around the fire with Victor Hugo or Shakespeare. You are sitting there with your own personal authors, the crushing expectations of your family, the relentless pressures of your career, the ghosts of your past mistakes. If you had to look them in the eye, what parts of your story would you gladly leave behind in the wreckage? And as you look out at the ocean, as it turns into an enormous amount of available space, what 4 new words would you choose to define your unwritten future?